Hello, I am Jill Satterfield, and this is my pop culture assignment. The topic I have chosen is Star Trek from the 1960s. Star Trek, the original series, was a science fiction TV show which first aired on September 8th, 1966, on the NBC television network. It was created by Gene Roddenberry. The show was produced by Desilu Productions, which was a studio that was owned by television greats Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Star Trek aired for 3 seasons from September 1966 to June 1969. Context: the 1960s and civil unrest. Let's see if I can get this around. Okay. The 1960s were a time of social upheaval and civil unrest, both nationally and internationally. The women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, and the war in Vietnam were a few of the major social issues of the era. There were widespread protests in support of these issues, which could be classified as counterculture protests. These issues of social unrest caused consternation about the future and diminished the optimism that had been apparent at the beginning of the decade in the United States in the early 1960s, when President John Kennedy first took office. The assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, followed by the assassinations later in the 60s of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, created a sense of pessimism and uncertainty about the future. The space race, starting in the late 50s and going into the early 1960s, was between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was in full swing by the 1950s. The race was on to be the first nation to land a man on the moon, and Russia leaped ahead in this race when, in April 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth in his Vostok space capsule. But John Glenn was not far behind. Later in 1962, he orbited the Earth less than 1 year later in his Friendship 7 spacecraft. And the space race and the technology that resulted created multiple innovations which influenced society then and for decades to come. Gene Roddenberry was a successful television writer by the 1960s. He had written for popular Western shows, which were very big in the 1950s. He had written for Have Gun Will Travel and Wagon Train, just to name a couple. When he pitched the idea of Star Trek to TV executives, he pitched it as a kind of wagon train set in space. He was a science fiction buff, and Roddenberry had a vision of the future as one in which humans had outgrown issues such as war and social injustice. And it was this vision that he attempted to show via Star Trek. By 1966, these social and civil issues had worked their way into the consciousness of the entertainment industry. And Gene Roddenberry's pilot for Star Trek was approved, and the show's writers and producers created 3 seasons of groundbreaking episodes touching on sexism, racism, and war and peace, using the fantastical mode of science fiction set far into the future. The cast was racially diverse, which was not really that common for the time period, and the setting was on the Starship Enterprise, which was part of the United Federation of Planets. Some of the current social issues of that time, one of them was racism. In the season 3 episode Plato's Stepchildren, the characters of Kirk and Uhura, Kirk was a white man, Uhura was a black woman. They share a kiss. This interracial kiss wasn't the first ever shown on television, but it did create much consternation among network executives who were unsure of how it would be viewed by the audience. There were different ways they talked about filming it without them actually kissing on camera, without showing their lips touching, because they were so worried about the reaction of audiences. They ended up just showing a kiss. They kissed on camera, and it was received really well. Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, she said that they received so much positive fan mail for that episode, more than any other episode they did. Another social issue they addressed on the show was war and peace and militarism. By 1966, when Star Trek started airing, the United States was fully involved in the Vietnam War. It was a very controversial involvement, and Gene Roddenberry used the series to touch on the subject of militarism and war and peace. He was sympathetic to the growing protests against the U.S. involvement in the war, and in the future in which Star Trek is set, most wars are seen as archaic and unnecessary. There are a few enemies that the characters in Star Trek come up against, such as the Romulans and the Klingons, but war is threatened, but generally they are able to avoid war and to resolve their disputes peacefully. And Star Trek today, it does continue today, many decades later. While the original series, it aired for only 3 seasons, and it wasn't really that popular at the time that it aired. It was not seen as a big success. But it became a pop culture staple years later when it went into syndication and it was aired. I remember watching it after school when it was aired as repeats, and that's when it became really popular. And it led to several films being based on the original series, starting in the late 70s and continuing into the 80s. And the popularity of those films led to new series being started. So the series franchise was reawakened in 1987 with Star Trek The Next Generation, which was very popular. And then it continues to grow. There were more series, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Picard is currently airing. There are currently 5 different Star Trek series in production and airing right now, and there are more in development. And I think this points to the power of a hopeful and peaceful vision of the future as one that appeals to many people, and why the series and the franchise has such an enduring impact. Through the lens of sociology, I think about Star Trek a lot through how it affects our culture and society and just hope for the future. And I think the optimistic future of the Star Trek universe, where conflict and inequalities have mostly been eradicated, it kind of veers away from the sociological concept of conflict theory, which says that social, political, and power differences contribute to how society functions. I think the focus is more on the theory of structural functionalism, where each part of society plays a role in how society functions as a whole. So just as a starship such as the Enterprise is dependent on each crew member to function, so does society in the United Federation of Planets in the future depend on contributions from each person, each group, and each planet that makes up the Federation. And these are some of the works that I used in putting this slideshow together, and I hope you enjoyed the slideshow.